الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين and all that. My dear brothers, please come forward and complete the lines. The khutbah is part of the salah, so just as you would not leave gaps in one, you cannot leave gaps in the other. We thank Allah who has gathered and guided us here up to this very auspicious moment, and that is the auspicious moment when we put our foreheads on the ground in sajda to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. I bear witness and testify, if it is indeed my last act, that there is no one worthy of our worship except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no one worthy of our praise except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bear witness and testify that 1400 years ago, a man, a human being named Muhammad ibn Abdullah, came to this earth with the last, final, and perfect revelation of God. We know this today as the Holy Quran, and I testify that there is no deviation, no distortion, no departure from the truth in this book. We say these things in English and we say these things in Arabic. When we say La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, which is the constitution that binds man to God, and therefore the constitution that binds man to man. As to what follows, we are now in an era where there are many elections happening all around the world. We see recently that in France, a little Napoleon called Nicolas Sarkozy and his model wife were defeated by a man who he was so bland that apparently he sat on a train and everybody on the train had no idea who he was. So in France we have seen changes. In other countries, in Greece, they cannot seem to form a government because of the elections and the crisis that is there. The U.S. is heading towards an election. Please, brothers, come forward. Please come forward and complete the line. We have elections all over the place in the Western world, and even Muslims seem to have gotten into the act. In Egypt, there may in fact be elections depending on who is permitted to run. We see that there is ongoing activity in Tunisia, where there was recently an election, and there are rumors that Pakistan may flirt with the idea of having a free and fair election. Having tried every other alternative, it seems that now asking the people what they want when there's nothing left might in fact be the path that is chosen by the good people of Pakistan. So when the subject of elections comes up, many brothers ask me all the time, who should they vote for, and why should they vote for this person or that person, and how they should participate, and so forth. And it really brings up a broader question, which is the whole entire issue of leadership. The dominant problem of our times as Muslims is we have grafted onto Islam a series of foreign or alien or un-Islamic methods of looking at the world. This is not always necessarily a bad thing. There was a period of time where, for example, Muslims did not understand science and technology in the early days after the Khulafa Rashidun. And yet, what they did was they translated a number of the Greek works and the Roman works, and even works from Hindus and others, and they began to take what was best from those things, and then they added their own sort of layer of understanding. So today, for example, we have algebra. Algebra is a form of mathematics that uses symbols rather than numbers. The original algebra is a Latin version of the word algebra, which is a text written by Muhammad al-Khwarizmi, who put together his own thoughts and ideas on the symbolic representations of numbers, but also incorporated the leading thinking of the best practices of the time. So we see that Islam is not opposed to this notion of taking the best ideas and thoughts that any human being might have and examining them and trying to put them to the best possible use. So Muslims, for example, believed, unlike today, for example, in the printing press. And many of the works of knowledge that were in Europe that would otherwise have been lost, we have today because Muslims translated them into Arabic and preserved those books. So when the people in Europe decided that reading was not the work of the devil again, essentially, they were able to recover their own thoughts and ideas that they had previously burned in various purges and so forth that characterized civilization. So we see then that if it is possible for Muslims to import ideas from other places and evaluate them objectively, and then take those ideas, take the best of them and add to them, if that is true in science, and that is true in logic, and that is true in reason, why shouldn't it be true in government? Many people ask. Many people say, what's wrong with a Muslim parliament coded on the lines of a British parliament, or a Muslim Senate coded on the ideas of the United States Senate, for example, or Muslim so-called constitutions which incorporate charters of rights and so forth in the fashion that Western governments have done so. And the answer to these things is not that anything is absolutely right or anything is absolutely wrong, but that we have to go back to the Sunnah. See, Islam is founded on two different and yet united things. One is the Quran and one is the Sunnah. The Quran is the text, but the Quran as a text is written in a fashion that would apply to all civilizations, all societies for thousands of years. At any one moment in time, for a human being to understand all of what is there, not easy. In fact, one of the pieces of advice that we're given in the Quran is apply what you understand from it, and what you don't understand, keep studying. And maybe God will grant you the wisdom to understand it, and maybe not. It's a very dense and depth and deep way of looking at the world. So you must read the Quran and understand the Quran, but alongside the Quran, we were blessed with something called the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the example of our Prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Sunnah is the biggest source of misunderstanding among every Muslim that you see. The Sunnah is the biggest reason why, not understanding it, we are where we are today. You don't see people trying to change the Quran. You don't see people saying, well, this verse was in and that verse was out, this kind of thing. But on the Sunnah, all manner of nonsense has been added, claimed to be part of the Sunnah. So what is the Sunnah, and how does it apply to leadership, and how does it apply to government? That's the subject of today's khutbah. So we start off with what is the Sunnah. Well, the Sunnah consists of four different things. First of all, it consists of what the Prophet said. Now, many people, the Prophet's life was a form of reality TV that, in modern terms, is unparalleled in history. Everybody who sat beside him, walked with him, lived with him, was his friend, used to ask him questions all the time. The man was constantly beset upon. Questions about the smallest things and the deepest things. Questions about how to deal with your parents, how to deal with your wives or your kids, how to deal with economic issues. So, what the Prophet said is a big part of the Sunnah. And there's a whole science that went into how it was related. So we have people that were called the companions, then we have people that were called the followers of the Tabi'un, then the generation afterwards called the Tattabi'un, and there's a whole science devoted to figuring out if the Prophet actually said what has been attributed to him by looking at the chain of people who give us this information. Okay? So that's one element. The second element is what the Prophet did. So sometimes the Prophet may not have said something, but simply took an action. So for instance, he collected the zakat. He prayed in a certain way. There were his actions inside the world. So many people would observe these actions because they were often done in front of the public. And so those actions were very, very important. The third element is what he saw but did not forbid. This is very important because the Prophet enjoined upon all of us in Islam this idea that a Muslim is someone who encourages what is right and forbids what is wrong. So if the Prophet himself did not forbid something when he saw it, there's good evidence to suggest that this is part of the tradition that we have to look at. Why did he forbid something or not speak against it, and what did he forbid and speak against? And so there's a third set of what was there. So there's what he said, there's what he did, and there's what he saw, but did not address in one way or the other. Okay? So the Sunnah is important because the Sunnah clarifies how we look at the Quran. But here is what is, in my view, the biggest single reason why Muslim societies have collapsed. The Sunnah as we know it had another element which almost nobody talks about in sermons these days. And that is the order in which the Prophet did things. Just as when you follow a recipe, first you put in, if you're making a cake, first you beat the eggs. You beat the eggs, then the base of the cake starts to rise. You put the icing on after the cake is already ready. You don't put the icing in first and the eggs in after the icing has been put in the oven, or you won't get the cake to work. The order in which you do things is very, very important. There's another fancy political word for the word order, and that's the word priorities. What was most important to do first? What was important to do second? So the first thing that you see is that within the Prophet's lifetime, for many, many years, all he talked about was the basics of faith, the unity of God. If the unity of God was not a difficult concept, he could have talked about it in 5 seconds. La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. There's one God. Okay, moving along. Let's talk about economic theory. But he didn't. He spent a lot of time going over and over and over again that there's only one God. Why? Because one of the reasons is people don't understand how easy it is to stray from what one God really means. Many people think today, oh yeah, we don't need to worry about this whole one God thing. Right? We don't see people on Yonge Street praying to idols, bowing in front of stones like they had in the Kaaba. And they missed the point. Because the point Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was trying to make with respect to one God is that whatever you follow in life is your God. The thing that you attach the most importance to is your God. If you have a choice between having to do the right thing or having to do something that, for example, makes you money, and you choose making money, what you're saying is that money, astaghfirullah, in that instance, is your God. Not right and wrong. And I could give you many other examples. So everybody has a God, but very few people know what that God is. And so this is why the concept of Tawheed was over and over and over again, because Tawheed talks about racism. So what is the connection between one God and racism? Well, if you start to build the connection of having one God, and one God creating all men as equal, and God deciding what the reason was why one person is better than another, once you take that decision away from people, the whole idea of racism or discrimination on wealth, discrimination based on class, or discrimination based on language, it all goes away. Entire systems of government and life were based on separating people, but if you really understood what the unity of God was about, you understood that all that got swept away. All of it. So a very simple idea had a very powerful application. And yet, this was the idea that the Prophet stood up for first. Because if people really understood what the unity of God was, there were many thousands of other things that you no longer had to explain to them. It was one thing that explained everything. So the order in which the Prophet did things is almost as important as the things that he said. And the order in which he did things is the biggest thing that we neglect right now. So you will find Muslims in a room, or sometimes not even speaking to each other, because one brother will argue with another brother over the angle of the foot at which the Prophet's right foot would hit the mosque. You will find Muslims arguing with each other violently over the length of somebody's beard. I'm not saying that those things are unimportant. I'm not saying that those things matter. I have a beard too. My father does not. He smiled and he said, it seems like the Taliban is coming back in his house. I said, no. But you know, and he is a far better person by any standard than I ever would be. So the point I'm trying to make is, the issue of how long somebody's beard was, it's not that it's important or unimportant. It is that the order of its importance, compared to whether or not people have food to eat, whether or not there's a Baitul Mal, a treasury, whether or not people are being educated as Muslims, whether or not Muslims are free from physical harm, those things are more important in sequence, because the Prophet paid more attention to them in sequence than the other things. First was the idea of Tawheed, the oneness of God. Second was the formation of an ummah, a community where people helped each other. Within the ummah, the most important thing was to build a mosque where people could meet each other. And within that mosque began the education, the sharing of wealth, the sharing of knowledge, the practices, and so forth in society. Those things were in order. Very quickly after that, there was the ability of Muslims to protect each other. And they formed for lack of a better word, a kind of a citizens' army. Notice I said citizens' army rather than professional army. Notice I didn't say group of Muslims deciding on their own to bomb other people's buildings. There was a logic and reason to this. There was a decision that was made together. Also embedded in that was the principle of shura, consensus. And this was very important as well, because everybody who accepted Islam accepted that the Prophet had communication through Angel Jibreel with God.